Hey there, my friend. If you're listening to this audio or you're reading this blog post, you're probably wondering about the Torah, which is the first 5 books in the Bible, or Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. For the last 3 years, I've spent a lot of time studying these books after I had a spiritual awakening. And I realized that the key to understanding why things happen in the way that they do in the world is understanding that there is a root of knowledge from which all things spring. And this root, or this eternal springtime of knowledge, is actually the first 5 books in the Bible, which were revealed by the prophet Moses starting in the year 1312 BC. Now, I discovered through this spiritual awakening that the key to resolving the problems of the world is found in these books. And what I discovered is the Bible itself all flows from the knowledge and the teachings that came from the prophet Moses. Essentially, Moses revealed a law. And then after he revealed it, the rest of the prophets in the Bible essentially continued to call people back to obedience and submission to this law, especially when they fall out. When the law was followed, the people of Israel prospered and created a unified, prosperous kingdom. When the law was ignored, they fell into chaos and destruction. When they were out of submission to the law, God sent messengers to bring them back into alignment with it, and their prosperity exponentially expanded again. After I discovered this, I realized that I had stumbled upon a great secret, that the key to creating a prosperous civilization was actually understanding and implementing the sayings in these 5 very misunderstood books. So I started to wonder, does anyone actually follow the teachings of Moses today? The answer may surprise you, and the simple answer to that question is just no, they don't. Many people teach the Torah, such as the Jewish nation, for example, and several different branches of Christianity, although they're small. Most of the modern sects of Christianity teach that following the Torah of Moses isn't necessary, and they don't even bother to try. They don't understand it, and most of the time they don't even read it, which is actually the exact opposite of what Jesus and the apostles taught them to do. In fact, the reason why the world has the problems that it does today is because people don't follow these sayings. And when civilization follows the teachings in Torah, the world will fall into peace, poverty will be eliminated, and human beings will operate in harmony with the natural world around them, eliminating the problems that have plagued humanity since the dawn of civilization. The fact is, though, that nobody follows the Torah. I've discovered by studying the teachings of the Jewish nation and Christianity, and by learning Torah itself, that it's actually not possible to follow in our current modern day for a variety of reasons. First, and I could go into this for a while, but I'm going to give you a few of them, okay? First, there's no temple in Jerusalem. If there's no temple, there are probably about half the commandments in the teachings of Moses that they can't be followed. All throughout the Bible, it's prophesied that in the last days, the temple in Jerusalem will be restored, and the ritual practices that were once done in the days of ancient Israel will continue. Without these sacred ordinances, Torah is impossible to follow and can never be done in full. Therefore, it's both essential and urgent for the restoration of the spirit of unity and power in humanity for the temple in Jerusalem to be restored and rebuilt. The time to do that is now. The next point to note is that many of the teachings in Torah are very difficult to follow due to clunky old processes and misunderstandings that come from every one of the main faiths that came from the prophet Abraham. For example, we're supposed to bind the commandments of God to our arms and our forehead. This is particularly a commandment for men. Now, the Jews have their own process that they have developed for this, and they're the only ones trying to do this, by the way, and they sell a product called a tefillin, which is a leather band that they tie around their arms and on their forehead when they're engaged in certain kinds of prayers. Actually, tefillin is not supposed to be worn only when you're praying in some sort of a ritualistic prayer. The children of Israel are supposed to have sections of Torah bound to their arms and their forehead all the time. Actually, there's not even any Christian person that I've ever met that even tries or makes any sort of attempt to follow this commandment, actually. There's no time restriction on this command. It's not something you're supposed to do now and then not do later in the day, or you're supposed to do it when you're praying in the morning. Actually, they're supposed to be wearing all the time. Right now, they're clunky, they're expensive. Actually, I went to a Jewish store in Central America. I asked them, and keep in mind, this is Central America, okay, where people really don't have a lot of money. And I asked them to see their tefillin. They were $600. Now, other than a tefillin, there's actually no way currently that's easy of fulfilling this commandment. So the fact is that because it's clunky and unnecessarily expensive, that most people, they won't do it. And the many that do only think that it needs to be done when they're praying, which is man-made traditions. That it's just something that along the way people just sort of made up a way to fulfill that commandment, and the way that they made up is, we're going to bind this prayer scroll to your arm, in this very expensive leather box thing that is written by a scribe in a certain way. Actually, people are just supposed to bind the commandments to their arm and their forehead. That's what they're supposed to do, and there's no time limitation on it, and it's not something that a majority of people. You say, well, what's the reason for that? Well, in the Torah itself, what it says is that people are supposed to bind the commandments to their arm and their forehead, that they'll follow the teachings or the sayings of the law rather than following after the whims of their heart and what their eyes see. They'll follow after the Torah. So it's kind of like a reminder, if that makes sense, that's constantly there in order to follow the commandments. And there's other things like little regulations and things that men are supposed to put on their clothing and whatnot that remind them of things as well. Other than the Tefillin, I want you to think about it. There's no way of fulfilling this commandment. So the fact is, because it's clunky, it's unnecessarily expensive, that people just don't do it anyways. And they think that it only needs to be done when they're praying, which is, again, it's man-made. No Christians, I've never ran into a Christian who even attempts to follow that. And one of the reasons is, of course, is because the way that it's done is not very cool. It's built to the traditions of men anyways, and there's no easy, simple way of doing it. So in addition to things that actually can't be done because they're impossible, and this would be, for example, showing up at the temple in Jerusalem certain times of the year, during certain holidays, for example, during temple services, there's the commandments that people just don't think are important, such as binding sections of the teaching, the law, or the Torah, whatever you want to call it, to your arms or your foreheads. In addition, there's some other small clothing requirements that we've mentioned. On top of that, there's festivals that go on through the year that Christian people just don't celebrate in general, and they don't generally actually even know when they are. Examples of this, happen like Shemini Atzorat, Hanukkah, Passover, and things like this. So if you're not Jewish, actually, these are actually difficult to participate in. For example, if you're not Jewish, they might ask you why you even want to participate if you try to go to Hanukkah. But they're very warming if you actually do go, and if you've got good reasons. Generally they wouldn't want, for example, Christian people to go there and try to preach to them. They're generally very warming, but they've also got to be very safe because they're very persecuted people. And there's been violence, obviously, against Israel and things like that. And so if you want to go, to Hanukkah, it actually might be difficult to participate anyways. If you're not Jewish, they might be like, well, why do you want to do this, right? And then Christian people, they don't celebrate it. They think it's not necessary, because, like they do with the whole Old Testament, right? Which is a very, 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 very important misreading and misunderstanding of the entire Bible to think that, right? So they might ask you for IDs, identification, weeks in advance. And then if you just thought about it like one day before you wanted to go, you just would not be able to participate. So Christians don't celebrate Hanukkah or the other festivals that are taught in the sayings of Moses. They just ignore them like they don't exist. And it's an important distinction that is actually not the way that it's supposed to be, right? Now, my simple answer to the question that I posed, who follows the Torah, is that nobody follows the Torah as it was meant to be followed, which is exactly, thoroughly, and completely by everybody involved with it. And much of the reason is that it can't be followed currently. And the few people that actually do try to follow all of it, right, there's only a few that do. They're doing something that's very difficult for the average person to do anyways. And a lot of it's because there's no easy, cool way for an average person, particularly if that person's not Jewish, as I mentioned. Even within the Jewish community, there's too much tradition that's overlapped on top of the actual sayings of Moses, to where the law has been altered, added to, there's been stuff taken away, and it's been changed in preference for traditions of men. Let me give you another example that I've noticed. Okay, so for example, the concept of this, there's a thing called a mezuzah, and the word mezuzah is not in an English Bible. Okay, the word mezuzah is, I believe it's a Hebrew word, and this idea comes from somewhat the Torah, which is the first 5 books of Moses, which Christian people would be familiar with as Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And most Christians actually, I don't know very many Christians that have actually even read those 5 books. And literally every book and every teaching and every prophecy and every saying of Jesus and every teaching from the New Testament actually emanates from those 5 books. It's actually impossible, if somebody is Christian, to understand the New Testament without understanding the law. And literally, virtually zero Christians I've ever ran into understand the law. I know like 5 of them that have any sort of decent understanding of it whatsoever, right? So then you've got the law, which comes from these things, and then you've got things that are overlapped and added to the law, which the law itself actually says don't add to or take away from the law, right? It's actually one of the commandments, one of the teachings. It's actually not commandments; it's teachings. One of the teachings in Torah, which is the law, is to not add to the law and to not take away from the law. And I want you to think about this, and this is going to be free flow for a second. I'm actually reading something that I wrote because I think this is important to convey to people, but this is going to be, I want to talk about this, okay? So an example is a mezuzah, right? There's no requirement to have a scribe who is specially trained write sections of the Torah in order to put them on your doorpost. Actually, the children of Israel were just supposed to write sections of the law on their doorpost. But today, even if you buy a mezuzah, you're not buying a section of the Torah that was revealed from Moses. You're buying a little box that contains a prayer scroll with Jewish prayers. Now, there's nothing wrong with this, and I think it would be fine if, a Christian person put some Christian prayers on their door, but actually the children of Israel were just supposed to put the commandments and put parts of the law or parts of the sayings of Moses on their door. They're supposed to put parts of the sayings of Moses on their arm. They were supposed to put parts of the sayings of Moses bound to their forehead, and that's actually not what anybody does. What everybody does is they follow traditions of men, essentially, but that's the only people that are even trying to follow these sayings and regulations. And this is actually a small section of the sayings and regulations, and even the people that are doing it are essentially doing some sort of altered version of it, okay, that is not actually what it says to do in the law. And by the way, again, I don't think that there's anything wrong with it. I'm just pointing out the discrepancy in what people are doing and actually what it says, right? And so that's an example of that. Another thing is, well, that's enough actually for now. Let me just continue on. Right. So again, nobody does this. Okay. So people, they don't think that it's important. Okay. So my simple answer is, again, nobody follows it. Nobody does. Right. Because it's impossible to do. And then you say, why it's impossible? It's impossible because there's no temple. We actually need the temple in Jerusalem to be restored and rebuilt for the Torah to even be possible to be followed. Okay. So again, they're not following the Christians aren't following the holidays. They're difficult to participate in anyways. People don't understand them. They don't understand why they're there. And these are all things that Jesus did, for example, for a Christian person, right? And it's important. Now, so I want to give you, again, this example, okay? So I go to the store, and so I'm asking about these things, and I'm just checking it out because I actually wanted to see these things. And they have all these very, very cool products. It's a Jewish store. And, again, it's $80 prayer scroll, a $30 mezuzah, a $700, actually was $700 for this tefillin, right? Which, I mean, if I had a $700 pair of clothes, piece of clothing on, I wouldn't wear it everywhere anyways. You know what I mean? That's just the way that I am. It's not that I'm cheap with everything. It's that I'm not going to, go spend $700 on a piece of clothing for a leather band that I wrap around my arm to put a prayer scroll in that really I'm just supposed to bind something to my arm. Unless I'm just trying to be stylish and I'm traveling around in Jerusalem itself or something like that. And then even the people there, they only wear that thing, in the morning or the evening when they're praying, they put it on and then they take it off. But that's actually not what it's for, right? It's there to remind you to follow the commandments, and it's supposed to be there all the time. But it's like this giant box that comes off your shoulder and this giant box on your forehead. It looks a little weird. It's not stylish, and that's actually not what the Torah itself says to do, right? So my main message, again, is that nobody follows the law, and it's actually a major problem. If you're listening to this, I want you to hear me out. The things that I mentioned are not all of the key points in the law. They're little things that I mentioned that nobody does. Okay. You say, why is it actually an issue? It's an issue because the solutions to the world's problems, I'm going to tell you something and I want you to listen. The solutions to the world problems will begin to manifest only when a significant enough amount of the people of Israel begin to gather and actually follow the instructions that were given to Moses several thousand years ago. That is when the solutions to the world problems, they're going to begin to manifest. And a lot of this, as you say, well, what does wearing sections of the Torah on your arm or your forehead have to do with solving the world's problems? It has to do a lot, actually, but I'm not going to get into that in this particular audio. I'm going to tell you that the actual solutions to world problems are going to begin to manifest when that starts to happen. Okay. And right now it's not happening, and right now nobody's doing it. And there's a bunch of other things people don't do. For example, people don't follow the eating laws. They don't treat animals how animals are supposed to be treated, for example. They don't follow the lending laws. There's a whole bunch of the Torah that people just don't follow, and then it can't actually be enforced as a law, as a legal system anywhere in the world either. And even the places that probably could enforce it, like Jerusalem and stuff, they've just essentially invented their own legal system. What I'll say is that we've got 50,000 pages of small business regulation that are unnecessary because people don't follow Torah, right? There's all sorts of stuff that goes on in society that we just don't actually need at all, because what we need is we need one law that is simple for everybody to be able to follow. However, going from where we are now, which is nobody following the Torah at all, or even really trying to having the Torah be a legal system is like a gigantic leap that just wouldn't happen anyways. And I've got a lot to say about that, right? My point is nobody follows the world right now, and the world's problems are going to be solved only when people start to do that, when people change and they decide to actually fall into alignment with universal law. Now it's time to begin doing that. It's time to begin creating a way for people to actually do this that actually works for people. That's all I'm going to say right now. If you want to prosper and you want to create supernaturally empowered, positive changes in your life, there's one place to turn that's never going to let you down. Okay, and that's the sayings of Moses. There's something, if there's something wrong that's going on in your life, and there's some sort of pattern that continues to repeat that's bringing some sort of destruction to your life, you'll find that every single time that a person, you're not following some of those sayings in those 5 books every single time when something wrong is going on in your life. We're promised, for example, the elimination of disease, the resolution of poverty, a prosperous civilization, and supernatural favor, among other things, by following these sayings, happy relationships, etc., etc. Remember, if you're Christian, the sayings of Jesus when he taught this, right? Now, this isn't exact, this is more from memory, but he said, "Think not that I'm come to destroy the law and the prophets." That's referring to those 5 books. Well, it's referring to those 5 books and the prophetic sayings that came after that too. So, think not that I'm come to destroy the law or the prophets. I've not come to destroy, but to fulfill. I say unto you that it's easier for heaven and earth to pass away than for one jot or tittle of the law to pass away till all be fulfilled. Whosoever therefore shall break the least of these commandments and teach others to do so also shall be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whosoever shall do and teach them shall be called greatest in the kingdom of heaven. That's actually very similar to what it says at the end of the book of the prophet Daniel, right? Which is that when the judgment day comes, they that turn many to righteousness shall be the stars forever and ever. That's very similar to what it says in the book of Revelation, for example, for Christians, right? That, God will reward everyone according to his works, right? Or when Jesus says, if any man shall do his will, he'll show no doctrine, whether it be of God or whether I speak of myself, or that, essentially people are rewarded for following the sayings. They're rewarded for following the teaching. Actually, the negative entities that arise in the last days, like, for example, the Antichrist is called by Paul what? It's called the Man of Lawlessness. Okay. Another way of saying that would be the man of Torahlessness. Okay. So the lawless person, what's the law? The law is actually the first 5 books of Moses, right? So we're promised all these things that are not happening because nobody's doing this. Nobody. And actually, this has been a realization of memorizing a bunch of the mitzvot, of going around and watching people who are trying to follow the mitzvot, of going and listening to a million rabbis talk about the Torah, to watching what people actually do who are within the children of Israel, specifically that are in Jerusalem, for example. They don't follow the Torah. The Torah is not used as a legal system anywhere. It's meant to be a legal system. The tithing laws aren't followed. The harvest laws aren't followed. The sabbatical years aren't followed, right? The lending laws aren't followed. And there's a whole bunch of other laws that aren't followed, and people don't even do basic things like not eat pork, not eat shellfish, and things like this, and follow the kashrut eating laws, right? Just remember that those laws, they still apply equally today as they did when they were revealed originally, because these are universal law. So we need to create a simple, practical way to actually observe Torah for all peoples on the earth who want to participate. Up until now, there's been nothing like this. It's time for the true nature of prosperity for all civilization to be restored, and that our society can begin coming together as part of something that isn't built by man, but it's built by God. There are many other things I can say right now, Yet it's my hope that this video clarified for you the answer to the question which I asked before, which was my question, asking if anyone in the world follows Torah, which is the simple answer to that question is no. And it's time that we change and realign ourselves with the supernatural laws of prosperity that didn't come by the will of men, but were revealed from the source of creation himself and is as timeless as the rising and the setting of the sun. So a lot of people, let me talk about this just for a minute, okay? Because I wanted to keep this message relatively short. Now, because it's been something that's on my mind for a while, I actually originally wanted to come up with a very detailed message describing exactly like what commandments people don't follow, but I just decided to give you some examples. There's actually tons of them that people don't follow. For example, they don't follow the Sabbath Day Commandments, which is just a rest day that that shows up once a week, and there's specific ways to do it. They don't wear tefillin. None of the temple based commandments are followed. None of them. 0 of them are followed. And that's a problem for everybody in the world, right? And there's a whole bunch of other things that people they don't do because they don't know that they need to do them. They've never been taught to do them, or they've never been given a simple, easy way to do them. Like, I'll give you an example with myself, okay? And a lot of this is that, I'm saying this with you because I don't follow a lot of this stuff either. There's a whole bunch of misunderstandings that people have about the law, for example. Like I learned about this, for example, requirement to bind the commandments to your arm and your forehead a while ago. I'm still not doing it. I'm going to be honest with you. And you say, why aren't you doing it? Well, the reason I actually have not been doing it is because I think the way that it's being done currently is clunky, overpriced, and unnecessary. And it's like overshooting the mark. And it's more along the lines of like, I'm not going to go expect 1,000 normal people to go follow a commandment that costs the entire monthly income of a family in a third world country, for example. So, I'm in a place in, Central America at the moment. And in Central America, a $600 tefillin, for example, that's the entire month's income for a family with maybe 2 kids, for example, down here. That's a very normal wage. And so it's not that, I don't want to do it, but it's like if I go and I do that and then I teach other people to do it in that way as well, for example, you've got an issue where the purpose of a commandment is being missed, because the purpose of it isn't to, be in fashion or be in style. The purpose of it is actually so when a man is walking around, he's constantly reminded of who he follows, right? That he's following universal law, that he's following the law of prosperity. There's a reason for it, and that's the reason. And we've gotten so stooped up in traditions of men and nonsensical modern interpretations that just have fluff and have no meat. That would be Christianity, where Christianity is essentially, and this is just honest, and I want to be honest with it. And again, I'm a sinner like everybody else, and as by a sinner, I mean I transgress different parts of the Torah a lot, and I've described some of them in this audio, and I'm trying to fix them, right? But Christianity has become the man of lawlessness described by Paul. So it's become, and it's a sad thing, because we've misinterpreted the law and the prophets and the sayings of Jesus based on a few verses that people constantly are wrestling with, that they make up their own definitions for, and that basically teach a person, because of misunderstanding, to do away with thousands of years of revelations that are promised that they're never going to be contradicted with. So, for example, the law was always given. Why are you talking about the law so much? It's because we got a lot of problems in the world right now, okay? We've got wars that are going on right now. There aren't many new wars with Donald Trump, thankfully. When Donald Trump's been in the White House in the United States, there's not been new wars. It's one of the big positive things, even for those of you that aren't Trump fans. I always liked him, but I kind of like everybody, you know what I mean, as well. So my point is with this, there's not been any new wars. It's been a very positive things for us for a long time. But we got a disease, we got a plague going on in the world right now. That plague, I don't know if you really call it a plague. I always missed up plague. I'll just call it the pandemic. That's what everybody's calling it, right? Actually, this came from people eating bats. This is where it came from. I mean, it came from a bat virus. And bats are something that's 3,000 years ago is in a list of food that you're not supposed to eat that was outlined by Moses in the Torah. The last maybe 5 pandemics that I've looked at all came from eating unclean foods or unclean parts of foods. For example, you got mad cow disease emanating from the nerves in the brains of cows, which is against Torah eating laws because you're not supposed to eat the nerves in the brain of cows. You've got the Black Plague, which came from people eating rodents. Rodents were outlawed in the Torah, right? You've got swine flu, which obviously came from eating swine. And I'm telling you, there's a lot more things. And these are little things. It seems like it wouldn't be that big of a deal for somebody to eat pig meat, for example. But the higher law in the Torah, you've got what's written as far as a list of regulations and requirements. The higher law in Torah would actually be civilization going towards a more vegetarian diet. You say, well, why is that? Well, because it's prophesied, for example, in Isaiah, and also at the beginning of the world, it was like this, where people were vegetarian, right? And a good majority of the problems that exist in our food supply from a long-term perspective would go away if the world decided together to turn away from the eating of animals and instead decide that we're going to be vegetarian for the good of not just ourselves, but all of humanity, right? And there's a lot of reason for that. For example, it takes much less water and much less land to feed a vegetarian than it does to feed a meat eater, right? It just takes less land to grow the crops to feed a vegetarian than to feed a meat eater, because when you eat meat, you first of all have to raise the animal, so you're getting a second level food supply. Essentially, the animal takes a bunch of land, and then plus after the animal takes the land, then you're eating the animal. You're eating second food or second-hand nutrition, essentially nutrition that has been passed through another living organism first. But also, we wouldn't be running into the issues that we're running into with overfishing the oceans, with animal cruelty, which is a tremendous issue. So I'm not even talking about that. We've got the world, because the world won't follow laws that were revealed thousands of years ago. We've got this giant, never-ending, it never stops growing, clunky legal system that nobody understands, that is completely unnecessary. We've got unsound money systems. We've got lending practices which destroy civilizations, and a never-ending, nonstop pile of debt. Because there's practices that are in the Torah that would basically, any civilization that was following the Torah as their law, as their legal system, would be a debt-free civilization, because their debt would be reset to zero every 7 years, right? So we've got this never-ending, nonstop, exponentially growing pile of debt. The nations are in debt. We've got money supplies that wouldn't exist, which is fiat currency, wouldn't exist from like basically a revelation-based currency. And the laws, the reason they need to be added to all the time and changed all the time is because men can never get it right. Because we're so out of submission, because we're so rebellious in our nature, because we're not willing to just submit to universal code that like on top of this code the universe was written, on top of this code the world was built, on top of this code the stars fell into their orbits, right? And so because we're not willing to do that, there's this nonstop, never-ending, exponentially increasing system that we need to set up to make up for the fact that we're broken and we're trying to fix it and we can't fix it, and nothing that we do is fixing it because we're not willing to submit to universal law. Torah is the way to bring the nations together. Actually, this is prophesied about for those of you that do believe the Bible, which I think is a lot of you, right? But even those of you that believe the Bible, have you actually even read it? You know what I mean? Like it's prophesied about, for example, in Ezekiel when David comes, that people will follow Torah. It's prophesied about at the end of Isaiah, that at the end of the world, the new heaven and the new earth, people will follow Torah. Jesus says it's easier for heaven and earth to pass away than for one jot or one tittle of law to pass away, right? Moses said you're not supposed to add one jot or tittle to this law. You're not supposed to take away. It wasn't those exact words, though, right? You're not supposed to add to it. You're not supposed to take away from it. Meaning that 100% of all of the sayings of Moses they apply in full force today the same way that they applied when they were revealed to the children of Israel thousands of years ago. You might now say, listen to this, I don't want to follow the Torah. The beautiful thing about Torah is that if you're not in the children of Israel, the Torah are not binding laws unless you voluntarily choose that you're going to follow them. Like I've chosen in my life that I'm going to follow them. You say, do you descend from Israel? I believe, yes, I do. And I talk about that. I could talk about that in another audio, but I think actually a lot of us descend from Israel. You've got probably in the world, you've got something like 10 or 12 million Jews. And that's one of the tribes of Israel. Actually, two tribes. I think it was the tribe of Judah and the tribe of Dan, or no, Benjamin. I think Judah and Benjamin kind of got absorbed into each other and are today what is known as Israel and known as Judaism. But Judaism, I want you to keep something in mind, that there were 11 other tribes of Israel that had probably different ways of keeping the Torah. And then in Christianity, they talk about how Christians, when they believe in Christ being their Messiah, that they're grafted in spiritually to the children of Israel. Now, a Jewish person might disagree with that interpretation, but this doesn't matter because Jewish people generally, there's some Jewish people that are also Christians, and generally Jewish people are not Christians. Generally, they're Jewish, but Jewish people are at least trying to follow the Torah. And I believe actually one of the reasons why there's this disharmony between Christianity and Judaism isn't because there needs to be. Judaism generally has a problem with Christianity. The biggest problem they've got is that Christians are not actually following the law. And they actually have the Bible and they say they believe in it. But remember what Jesus says is that not everybody that says to me, Lord, Lord, shall enter the kingdom of heaven, but he that doeth the will of my Father which is in heaven. He that does the will. And that falls in line with, literally from Genesis to Revelation, one singular, focused message on producing a righteous people, a people that are set apart, a people that are chosen. Right? So you have Israel, a lot of them were scattered, and you say, how do I know if I'm a part of the children of Israel? In the last days, the angels are going to be released in the world, and they're going to begin gathering Israel. Okay? And also, again, the children of Israel were scattered. Nobody knows where they went. They begin to refer to them as the lost tribes of the children of Israel. However, in the last days, the children of Israel are going to gather. They're going to gather, and they're going to follow Torah again. In the book of Revelation, it talks about how in the millennium, in the 1,000-year period of peace, that they would also teach in Judaism as the Messianic age. What are people going to be following? They're going to be following Torah. Therefore, because none of us are following Torah, right? I want you to hear my message. If you're listening to the sound of my voice, doesn't matter if you're Jewish, Islamic, doesn't matter if Islamic people would not have a problem with the people following the Torah either, because they believe in Moses, okay? Torah can bring together the three biggest peoples on the earth, right? Or at least two of the biggest peoples on the earth, right? You'd have Judaism is actually not one of the biggest people in the world, but they're one of the most influential. But you have Christianity, for example, you have Islam. Islam people would not be opposed to following the Torah. If Christianity could get their minds around, okay, this idea that this is something that we're going to do together, and the reason we're going to do together is to bring together the peoples of the world, we could make giant strides towards having a society that's built in a totally new way. So it's not a matter of whether the Torah applies. It's not a matter of whether the law is eternal. Jesus said, until heaven and earth pass away, not one jot nor one tittle of the law shall pass away. In other words, none of it's going to pass away until it's all fulfilled by everyone. And actually, even in the new heaven and the new earth, people are following the new moon ceremonies and the Sabbaths, right? They're remembering the cycles of the moon, the cycles of the stars. They're actually looking up at the sky. They take their swords and they do what when that happens? What do they do when that happens, right? They beat their swords into plowshares. For those of you that don't know what that means, it means they take their weapons, war and destruction, melt them, and they beat them into tools to till the earth. Because at the beginning of the world, we were given a commandment, right? And what was that commandment? To take care of the earth, to dress it, to keep it, right? Literally, like the first commandments that were given, the first sayings that were given in Torah were to protect the creations of God, right? Have children, to till the earth, right? Because out of the earth we're taken from dust. right? We come from the dust of the earth and the skies. This is what we come from, right? So the very first thing we're supposed to do is we're supposed to take care of the earth. And that's the biggest thing that we're not doing right now. So we take our weapons of war and destruction, and instead of fighting each other, we unify. And we say, we're going to build a civilization that's built in love for the Creator and His creation and love for each other. That's what Torah is actually all about. It's about building a civilization that can prosper. Literally, it has the ability to prosper forever because it's built on a sustainable framework that was revealed from heaven. That's what it's actually about. That's actually what my message is all about, but we don't have a way of doing it, and this is a problem. And those of you who are influential in Jerusalem who listen to my things, it's time. Listen to me. Listen to the sound of my voice, and I want you to understand how important this is that I'm saying this, okay? It is time right now for whatever needs to happen, for whatever excuses that need to get gotten over to be gotten over, for whatever deals need to be struck, for that temple in Jerusalem to be rebuilt. I'm telling you guys, in the future, there will be many temples, not just one, that will be the Mosaic style, Old Testament style temples, because it will become necessary because of the amount of people that are practicing Torah and where they live in the world. They'll be all over the place. There will be lands of Israel all over the place. But it's time for the temple to be rebuilt, for the Torah to be the law of the land once more in Jerusalem, right? And for people to voluntarily decide to fall into submission to universal law, because when we do this, I'm going to tell you something. If you want to know what's going to create prosperity for everyone, you want to know what it is? It's not going to be some change the Democrats are going to make. And it's not going to be some change the Republicans are going to make, unless the Republicans and the Democrats both get together and they say, what we're going to do is we're going to follow universal law. Because when we follow universal law, let me tell you something that's significant for everybody here to understand, that listens to me. It's significant for you to understand and for me to understand. When we follow and submit to universal law, which is hard, okay? This is not an easy walk. It's not something that's like, oh, I'm going to do it today and not do it tomorrow, or I'm going to say a little prayer one time in my life, never, and then I'm doing it. No, this is something that actually we do through the day and every day, and all day we think about it, and all day we do it together, and all day we speak it together. But when we do it, what happens is that evil is purged from the land. And I mean evil in every form. You know what I mean? When we choose to do that, okay, what happens is that grace and forgiveness and love will be poured out on the nations. So, first of all, it's time that we even have the ability to follow Torah again, which right now we can't. Even if we're wearing the expensive $600 box, which is just impossible for somebody in Central America to do, because they're like, that'd be like their whole month's income. They'd have to be on a payment plan for like 3 years to pay for something like that, right? But even if they're wearing the very expensive Teflon or whatever, which I know I talk about that a lot, and that's not a bad thing that the Jews can make money and stuff like this. They're allowed to do that, okay? It's just not the only way to do that commandment. My point is with this, though, is it's not just that we need to create a simple way for people to actually follow the very simple things in Torah that they have the ability to follow now. It's not just that we need to do that. And look, regardless of what our religious differences are, regardless of what our belief differences are, regardless of what you believe or I believe or the Jews believe or this Christian denomination believes, it doesn't matter. Let me tell you something that does matter, that Torah is still the law of the land, and it's the only true law of the land there ever has been. It's the only true law of the land that there ever will be. That's a true law, because this did not come from what people wanted. This came from what God wanted. Okay? It's the only law of the land there is anyways. What we've put on top of that is just abomination after abomination, after ridiculous invention after ridiculous invention that is totally unnecessary and is not whole and does not solve the problem, that just drives us more into disbelief, into chaos, into disunity. There's one thing that has the ability to unify the world. And I've thought about this in a million different ways. I've been like, how do we do this? How do we do this? How do we take everybody and bring them together? And everything that I try to invent breaks. Except for one thing. And that's Torah. Hear my voice and listen to me. Torah is the way to bring the world together. It is the way to bring the world together. It's the only way that'll work. But we need the ability, those of you that are influential, those of you that are rabbis, we need the ability to follow it, because right now we don't have it. We don't actually have a way of doing this. We don't have a simple way of doing this. We don't have a way for Christian people to do it in Israel to do it alike. We can't actually even do it because it's impossible to do. And those of us that are Christians, those of us that believe in Jesus, Jesus said, if you love me, keep my commandments. Right? John said that those of us that love him should walk even as he walked. Jesus followed Torah. The written word, the Torah revealed by Moses that's written down in the 5 books of the Bible is what he followed. He didn't necessarily follow the Talmud, for example, which is fine for the Jews to follow. If the Jews want to follow the Talmud, it's fine for them to follow that. That especially is not going to be binding, for example, on Christian peoples. But if we want to bring the world together and we want to actually create peace and we want the world to actually prosper and we want people to stay free, and we want laws that actually make sense, that will actually do what they're supposed to do. There's only one law that will ever do that. And that's Torah. So right now, does anybody follow the Torah in the world? Does a single person in the world follow the Torah all the way through? No, there's not even one. There's not even one that does it. There's not one person in the whole world that does it. A Christian will come along and they'll say, well, this is the reason why we need a Savior. Because we have his righteousness, which is true. I believe that. Okay? It's the reason we have a Savior, because we have his righteousness, because we can walk in his righteousness. But does that mean we should just go around and walk all over universal law because we've got somebody once that was perfect? Or should we walk even as he walked? Right? My point with this is that is not an excuse. The Christians should be banding together with the people of Israel, with Jerusalem, with all the lost tribes of Israel. There's probably over 100 million, maybe 150 million people of Israel in the world that have been lost and scattered and don't even know who they are. We don't know where they went. We don't know who their children are. They got lost. Maybe you're one of them. If you're listening to the sound of my voice, I bet you you've got something in you. Now, we don't have the ability to bring them together, to unify them. We don't have the ability for peace to manifest because that temple's not rebuilt in Jerusalem. We should all be banding together, pitching in, figuring out a solution in order to make that temple happen in Jerusalem. It needs to happen for peace to come. There's been remarkable progress in peace in the Middle East. Not peace like there will be and there can be when the temple's restored, when the sacrifice and the oblation starts again. It needs to start again in its time. And that's not the only thing that needs to start again. We need to build the new Jerusalem. We need to build the new Israel. We need to build a unified tribe of people that are going to make a decision together that we're going to do our best no matter what it takes to follow universal law. Because here's the thing. The Torah will never be able to be the law of the land until there's enough people that are willing to follow it anyways, even when it's not. Until that happens, it could never be the law of the land, which is a simple, one single, unified law that was revealed that everyone can follow, that anybody can do, that anybody can learn, that anybody can master. But it's not going to be restored. We're not going to have a restoration of all things. We're not going to have a restoration truly of all things that's been spoken by the mouths of the holy prophets since the world began, until there's enough people that are simply willing to follow it, until we actually have the capability of following it, which right now we don't. And I want you to hear me. And maybe we can work together and create a solution for that, because I think it's important. This is my message for today. This is way longer than I thought it was going to be. Prosper, be blessed, and I'll see you on the beaches of the world.